Welcome to the Place of Rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. In today's episode, Virginia discusses how understanding our internal spiritual and psychological terrains is the key to resolving external chaos, leading to freedom and rest. We hope you enjoy today's conversation.
If we don't have the moral conviction to show up with curiosity instead of judgment, there's an enormous amount of confusion, chaos, and dis-ease that will emerge, because when we don't show up with curiosity and humility and ask questions, address issues without attacking people, we're not exercising our liberty, which is our capacity to self-govern. The highest capacity that we have, the highest integrity in our capacity to self-govern. And if we do not use that appropriately, we can't have freedom. There is no freedom without liberty. The preservation of freedom, which is the highest desire of everyone's heart, is to be free, requires that we exercise our individual liberty, which is our capacity to self-govern. So if we don't show up with curiosity to these for ourselves, by the way, like, why am I so angry? Why am I so anxious? Why did I just say that? Why did I just talk to that person that way? What made me do that? If we don't show up with curiosity about ourselves and what's happening among our own constituents, spirit, soul, and body, we cannot show up with any measure of integrity in the life of another person. We just can't, because you know what we show up with? Judgment, criticism, and we assassinate each other's characters with our assumptions. So it becomes really important to show up with measures of curiosity. Well, to do that, I think there has to be a measure of humility. So I think we've been talking about that. But I can also say, as I look back on this last month, we talked about the mission of rest repeatedly, and why the mission of rest is freedom. If we don't understand the anatomy of freedom, which is the necessity to exercise your sovereignty, take responsibility about how you govern your mind, your heart, your will, your conscience, your liberty, you can't be free. So if we're not free and we don't manage and self-govern our passions, our ideas, ourselves, if we don't govern our own constituents, and our mind, our heart, our will, our conscience, and our feelings, and the conflicts we have within ourselves, if we don't exercise liberty, we can't secure freedom. So we tend to look we all desire rest. We need rest. Without rest, we die. But we have a tendency to look for these things outside of ourselves, when in fact it's something that we have a lot of power and authority over. And so we talk about our identity, we talk about our image, spirit, soul, body. We talk a lot about identity and where we get our identity. And we talk a lot about why those two things are important in the context of our purpose and what our life looks like. And generally, the people that come talk to us is because there's confusion, chaos, and disease in their life. Something is not right and they're not well, whether it's spiritually, psychologically, or physically. Those are the people that come see us. They need rest. They want rest. And they're compelled by the framework that we use to resolve these conflicts, right? So this whole month is about why rest. And in one word, I guess we can summarize it in one word. We invite you to reason and displace arguments and ideas that rise up against the knowledge of the things that are true as they pertain to reality. And we displace them so you can live in the freedom of wholeness. You can live free. And then, of course, we broke it down into the individual relationships, communities, families, and all that. And I think last episode, we talked a lot about humility, vulnerability, curiosity, and extending each other the dignity, the respect of showing up with measures of curiosity and tolerating questions that make us, and questions and answers, right, that make us uncomfortable. So that's, I think, by way of summary, that's where we've been spending a lot of time. We just had an executive meeting and we're going through a national accreditation process that it's been a year-long process that has caused us to defend the merit, the value, the framework, and the process that we use to help people. Those are big themes because we don't look at narratives and situations like that, and we don't have a blanket explanation, a blanket method. We spend an incredible amount of time delving deep into a person's history, how they've governed their lives, their thoughts, their convictions, their feelings, to educate ourselves in them on how to best serve them with anger, with bitterness, with hurt, with confusion, with chaos, with disease, right? But we see the root of these things as ultimately compromising a person's identity. So when a person is generally in a place of deep conflict, we can prove to them that the real conflict is not outside of them with other people, but it's contained within themselves. So we change the script. People want to come in to know how to deal with things outside of them, but we immediately shift the script to find out. And sometimes we're not able to shift the script. So we have to consult their brain, their central nervous system, their body. We have a lot of biometrics that we use to do that. So we can understand the conflict between the stories they're telling themselves about the anatomy of the problem, but in fact what their body's carrying. So what we do, that's a long answer, is although we listen and we're present and we listen and we process and we digest all this with them, that's not our starting point. The basis and the framework of all those problems that people are facing is not our starting point. We kind of turn that on its head almost immediately within a very, very short period of time. We don't look at problems and try to solve them or help people solve them. We look at problems differently, whether it's cancer, autoimmune disease of the spirit, the soul, the body, or relationships. It doesn't matter. We look at problems of possibilities. So whenever there's a problem, we know there's a breach in communication between the spirit, the soul, and the body of that individual that we need to restore first and foremost, because that's where they're going to find the possibilities to mitigate everything they're going through. Because we know that there's purpose in the problem. There's a necessity in fleshing out and consider and working through the possibilities to get to the purpose. But when a person is able to identify, has a faith, strength, courage, whatever you want to call it, to identify and call a spade and identify something for what it is, I think that's a great starting point, because there's a measure of integrity there. And there is a measure of, it's a good baseline. It's a good baseline when somebody is able to come in, objectively identify a problem and be truthful with what it is, with what they're struggling with. It's a clean slate for me, because it helps me identify where the breach of communication is between the spirit, the soul, their body, among their own constituents. So when people tend to identify a problem, I'm not looking at the external dilemma. I'm looking at the internal function that's creating a breach in that dilemma. And I wonder what the purpose of that is. I absolutely know that a man is perfected by the things he suffers. I've lived long enough, and we've been in this line of work long enough that I see the refinement of suffering. But we don't suffer without problems and without challenges. So we tend to look at those things a little bit differently here, and we don't spend a lot of time problem solving, but we do spend an enormous amount of time on treasure hunts for the possibilities and the purpose in those problems. So yes, we have a different way of looking at the dilemmas that compromise our mental, psychological, and physical health. we look at those things with a lot more curiosity. And I think we talked a little bit about it again this month in the context of personal relationships with ourselves, the personal relationships we have with others, and the personal relationship we have within ourselves and our own constituents, the relationship we have with others, and of course, and how that shows up in, marriage, family, and in work relationships, and of course, in our spheres of influence, at a state level and nationally. That's why it's so fruitless when we get into political arguments with people, because politics, policies that are developed and create the framework within which we live, that's downstream from government, individual self-government. And so even the political discourse is futile without taking a close inventory. Hey, what's happening within me? It's easy to become critical of people outside of us, but why don't we look inward a little bit? And that principle, again, applies when you're dealing with family, spouses, children, the whole thing. And I want to say one thing, and we're going to be talking about this in the next episode. I'll talk about it a little bit more extensively. See, we're always dealing with terrains, with lands. We're always talking with terrains. We're talking with something very tangible that seems so distant. And the terrain of our spiritual life, the terrain of our soul, and the terrain of our body are very specific, very unique, very intricate realities, very tangible things that we do not understand. So the consequence, the outcome of these things is so far removed from what we need to resolve the problem. So it's not that we don't care about people's stories. It's just we have to go where the anatomy of the problem is, or the anatomy of where the solutions really take place, which is internally. This is great because we're transitioning next month into the illustration and the pilgrimage of rest. As our listening audience knows, but for those of you that are new, the rest is not a random conversation that we have around a topic that seems confusing. Rest is a very specific word that defines and explains this realm we're inviting you to consider, this condition we're inviting you to consider, this frame of mind is really more accurately that we're asking you to consider, because that's where you're going to find the power to live free and the authority to live free. And it's accessible to every single one of us, no matter what is happening in our lives. It's accessible for you today. So basically the discussions take place around 12 modules: the spirit, the soul, the body, January, February, and March. And then in every April of every year, we're going to get into the mission and vision of rest, which lays a foundation for really the practical aspects of what we do. We spent an entire month discussing that in a myriad of different ways. But this next month is one of my favorites, which is the illustration. So we talked about why rest, which is freedom. And now we're going to illustrate for you how you can live free. And I'm exceptionally excited about my guest speaker that's going to help me really introduce this subject, because she has been with me for almost 9 years now. She's one of my sickest patients that I've ever had, spiritually, psychologically, and physically. Had multiple competing diseases that were afflicting her body. She was like a house of cards that was just collapsing. Tried everything and was at the end of herself. Spent over $250,000 trying to heal. And after one 5.5, 6 hour session, what she experienced was nothing short of miraculous, but it was really the integration of what we just discussed. And I want to tell you that we just had a fascinating conversation. She's been part of our team now for about 4 years. And she says she's never leaving rest. She always reminds me of how pivotal engagement with rest was, and what began to be her pilgrimage out of suffering. And conversation of terrains. I just mentioned that Jenna had a highly compromised spiritual terrain, psychological terrain, and a greatly afflicted physical terrain. And because of the framework of that I touched on this last month, I was able to quickly identify where the breach in communication was between those things. But the concept of terrain really became important to me because it specifies a space. It specifies a very specific space. And I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have with Jenna because she was so severely compromised within herself in those three terrains, the spirit, the soul, the body. Those three terrains were so compromised. There was no communication between each of them. And they reflected the life of her heart, which the life of our heart is cultivated in our homes. The role of relationships, which is how we bind, how we attach to our moms, our dads, our siblings, and to the ideas, to the experiences we've had. And how our brain, the imprint in our brain, and what that looked like, which is another terrain, right? And of course, the value of our story. So that's psychoneuroimmunology. So I was able to identify what happened in those realms and the impact on this larger narrative, which is the story of her life. And I'm so excited for everyone to hear us have this discussion because I think it's going to be rich. I think it's going to be very specific. And I think it's going to give people a lot of hope of how they can translate what they hear us talk about into their specific circumstances. I'm very excited about that. And that's the illustration of, okay, now we know why rest is important. Maybe it's caused us to think about rest a little bit differently. But now you're going to illustrate for me how this shows up in the life of the heart, the role of my relationships, the meaning of the pictures that frame my life, and of course, the value of my story. You've got to understand what's happening inside of you. The problem is generally not outside of you. It's within you. I want people to find hope. I think we've been educated, we have been indoctrinated, and we have been persuaded to look at life through a prism of victimhood. Because when you raise a generation of victims, they're always dependent on something outside of themselves to change their condition. And it's a lie. And I can prove it, that the agent of change and the agents of change and the process of healing is contained within you and how you look at the world. I touched a little bit on terrains and why understanding the condition of the terrain becomes really important, because if we don't understand our terrain, we cannot combat the things that afflict the terrain and cause it to be unproductive. So your spirit, your soul, or your body. We're going to talk about how confusion and chaos lead to disease in the sphere of medicine, but we're going to go beyond that. We're going to talk about the German theory that there is a limited foundation in medicine. It's faulty because it's limited. It's not the whole picture. We're going to be looking for the wrong things that will lead to wrong outcomes. And I'll give you a hint in that. If you don't understand the terrain and the anatomy of the spiritual terrain, the psychological terrain, and the physical terrain, and how they're supposed to interact, you're going to be sunk. You can't heal. You won't be free. We're going to talk about ways that we can free ourselves from the paradigms that shackle us and our bodies, all in the light of the fact that our bodies have innate intelligence. We're going to talk about the popularity and the rise in parasite cleanses and how social contagions played a part on this. We're going to talk about why cleansing can be beneficial for some and create an inflammatory response for others. We got to be careful about how we cleanse. By the way, all those terrains, the spirit, the soul, and the body. If we're not careful, it can make people very sick. And we're going to talk about how tending to our terrain is a key to vitality because it restores communication within, among, and between them, the terrains. Again, the spirit, the soul, the body. How terrain theory and rest both focus on liberty and freedom. Got to think about cause and effect. We're going to help people distinguish, is it a parasite or is it a terrain problem? How confusion, chaos can lead to disease in the sphere of medicine, and how medicine was built on a faulty foundation of just germ therapy. So we're going to unwrap that. We're going to look for how wrong things can lead to wrong outcomes. We want people to be able to free themselves from paradigms that shackle them, reminding them that their body has a unique intelligence, their soul has a unique intelligence in the form of intuition, and the spirit has a unique intelligence in terms of its capacity to discern. I'm kind of excited about understanding. If we know why rest, now we need to know what's an illustration of it. And it's great because we're going to talk about, in short, the life of the heart, which begins in our home. That's a sphere of influence. That's a terrain. The role of relationships, which is attachment. That's very specific. And we have a lot of science and biometrics to measure that. The meaning of pictures. And that's woven into the tapestry that directly impacts the connections and the interconnections in our brain. Memories contained in images, not words. We have a lot of acoustic mirroring technology and systems to identify what that is. And then, of course, the value of story, which brings it all together. So I'm really excited about what's coming.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about rest, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of Rest. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of rest, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to Rest with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.